Economists have described the softer inflation print for November as a rare sight of good news for consumers in South Africa. Stats SA released the annual consumer price inflation for November on Wednesday. And according to this report, headline inflation dropped from 5.9% in October to 5.5%. Lower fuel prices led to some reprieve consumers as the decline was mainly driven by a monthly decrease of 5.5% in the fuel price index, which drove the annual rate for fuel lower to 1.8% in November from 11.2% in October. This, in turn, led to a reduction in the annual rate for transport, which decreased to 4.3% from 7.4%. This morning, Phelisa Nkomo, an economist, joins me to help us understand this better. Phelisa, it's nice to have you on Business Edge. Now, economists have described the softer inflation print for November as a rare sight of good news for consumers. How excited should we be about the marginal drop in inflation month on month? And do you think that the downward trend will continue?
Thank you very much. I don't think that the downward trend will continue, by the way, because it's actually not influenced by what we call endogenous factors. It's true, though, that when the Monetary Policy Committee met last month, they did not increase interest rates, the repo rate, so it stayed the same. Even though the inflation targeting, it's still within the boundary of 3 to 6%, South Africans have not been able to actually benefit. You'd know, for instance, that every time there's a decline in fuel prices, normally citizens would benefit after 2 to 3 months. In fact, even though citizens would actually want to accrue those benefits quite immediately, both in a form of reduction in the cost of food, and it's December time. Families are really spending time together during this period. That's one. But I also think that the second issue is that what has influenced this decline in CPI is actually other exogenous factors which are related, for instance, to fuel. So, and that's why we actually having this the decrease. But I do not think that we're going to be able to sustain it for next year, because remember, as long as we still experience the Ukraine and Russian war, unto which we get some of our primary inputs, both in agriculture, but as well as we get some of our oil in other markets outside of the South African economy, we'll still continue to experience higher food prices. So I'm not entirely optimistic.
Now, much of this deceleration can be attributed to lower fuel prices, which in turn led to a reduction in the annual rate for transport, which decreased to 4.3% from 7.4%. Now, with all that the South African government has done in tandem with SARB, is it that this decline in fuel prices will continue?
As I'm saying that, I think we must actually study what were because every decrease in either consumer price index or production price index, it's normally influenced by several interventions within the economy, either from a domestic perspective, but also from the international market. And I do think that, the fuel prices, the decrease in fuel prices would contribute, by the way, and the cost of transport in South Africa, which is actually quite high. In fact, one of the key things we've really been experiencing recently has been an increase in the tax industry, where, for instance, the tax industry has really been, complaining that with the interest rate increases versus the cost of transport, they have not been increasing their prices consistent to their central bank. So what they would normally do, either they would wait for 3 or 4 types of increases, and then they'll then increase their prices. So in essence, we should be able to capture that, meaning in this context, users of the taxes should be able to capture that. But I still think that because the tax industry is actually a very governing sector, so no one can impose onto them whether they should increase, the cost of tax industry or not. They are not likely to actually reduce the prices because for several windows of interest rate increases, they have not increased the price. But there's something else, by the way, that I need to raise is that because there's a link between the demand for transport and versus the cost of transport. Now, we've seen a decline in demand for transport because a lot of people have been laid off since COVID. I'm not sure, you might be aware that,
Okay.
a lot of South Africa, about 2.7 million
Now,
have lost jobs. So it means that the demand for taxi industry, or the use of transport, is actually very low.
to quickly wrap things up, earlier on, I talked about the acceleration witnessed in food and non-alcoholic beverages in terms of prices. We said to have increased about 0.9%. And one can only imagine how households would be reeling from that particular surge. Now, how are South Africans adjusting to this sort of spike and other spikes or increases that we have seen so far? What are the instigators and how can they be addressed?
South Africa has produced food for export markets, not for domestic markets. So that's the first instigator. So meaning that we then have to import, certain primary agricultural products for us to produce food. That's the first one. So what happens is that whenever a country, relies from imports to feed its nation, you're likely to experience food increases. So that's the second point. So even though South Africa is actually a food secure country in terms of the production volumes, but in fact we have about 14.2 million South Africans who go to bed without food, who are also food insecure. We have to decide on whether to eat in the morning or lunchtime or evening because they have access to only 1 meal a day. So that's the third issue. I think that the fourth issue is that, in fact, the food spikes, amongst the key things that it's going to do is that it's going to lead into people spending less. But also, we do know that because of this is actually a December period, and you have a culture of collective saving systems during this period, and now sometimes people would then start sharing either the groceries or use the money they've been saving to buy groceries, and at face value that is going to appear as though people are spending. But I'm also aware that people have not really been saving a lot in this year. The data shows that people have not been saving a lot. And so the implication is that you're likely during December, those to have families who are actually going to be food insecure. And the fundamental issue that we need to deal with in South Africa is the high concentration in the food production value chain. The market, is actually controlled, the food production sector is actually controlled by between 8 to 10 firms, which is linked to both from primary production
Okay.
into right into the fork. Every South African here, they have to walk in, 85% of South Africans have to walk in the shops to be able to access food. So fundamentally, that indicates poor agricultural planning
Okay.
systems
Well, I tell.
within the South African society.
Okay, well, Phelisa, I tell you, even as we see that inflation is said to be cooling in South Africa, one other thing that we may also continue to put our eyes on is to see if the interest rate hiking cycle would cool off or slow down. Of course, that would be a prerogative of the MPC. Phelisa Nkomo, Economist, thank you so much for talking to us at this time.